As many have already guessed, today we have again a representative of the largest diaspora in Hollywood, the Australian one, called Chris Hemsworth. Chris came not alone, but with his entire family, like brothers and sisters. So now we have Chris Hemsworth and several of his more budget versions. Chris himself is quite an interesting guy in Hollywood. He's one of the best players in Bad Luck, a scarier version of Margot Robbie. By the way, she's also Australian, so they have a lot in common, except he has Marvel movies instead of Barbie. In the Disney series about guys and girls in colorful spandex, he's one of the most intriguing and textured characters. The box office for all his movies is also personal, but as soon as Chris tries to appear in a movie without his hammer, it immediately becomes a box office failure. Bad luck follows him even in those movies where he doesn't play the main role. With such an interesting but unlucky actor, there's a risk of becoming a black mark, meaning studios might start refusing his participation simply because they don't want to incur the wrath of the gods. It will be very interesting to see his career when or if something happens in the Marvel universe and his lifeline disappears. Nowadays, the universe is often buried and various rumors float around about its reboot after the Secret Wars, which are still coming out somewhere in the 27th year. Maybe Chris's countdown has already started. In the big screen, Chris entered, like many Australians, through Australian TV series. These series usually aren't needed by anyone except Australians, so the chances of breaking through aren't that many. But as we already know, some are lucky. And Chris is one of them. He hopped around various projects and roles for a few years, passing by, encountering that very luck. He ended up in Santa Barbara, an Australian version called Home and Away. The show has over 8,000 episodes since its debut in 1988, and new episodes are still airing today. Chris appeared in 170 episodes from 2004 to 2007. In the early 2000s, the ratings of the show began to decline, and Chris, first as a discovery and then as the best young actor in 2007, decided it was time to conquer Hollywood. Leaving the series, he started auditioning in America and eventually landed in Star Trek. Luck played a role here as well. Director Abrams tried to persuade Matt Damon to play Chris's father in the film Panna. Abrams didn't disclose why Damon declined, but he called his refusal quite logical. Damon himself believes that an actor of his caliber could indeed distract the audience, and at that time, Hemsworth, who was still not in demand, was perfect for the role. Star Trek performed decently at the box office and even better on carriers, but in his next film, Perfect Getaway, the actor stumbled even before Star Trek hit theaters. If it weren't for Star Trek, his career might have taken a slightly different turn. Perfect Getaway reached theaters 3 months after Star Trek and completely flopped, earning $22 million with a budget of $14 million. The situation with the actor's next project was even worse. Despite being released in American theaters on 27 screens, the revenue per screen was so meager that they didn't expand Chris's presence in theaters, and the film was sent to carriers. It managed to collect around $5 million at the box office. In general, with such successes, Chris's career should have ended somewhere here, but Star Trek helped him get into the cinema that few were interested in at the time. While big money was being made in theaters, Chris was already playing the God of Thunder. To secure the role of Thor, he had to step over his own brother. In those years, they weren't particularly needed by anyone. Here is where the division of the Hemsworths into expensive and budget versions happened. They were selected for the final audition along with Alexander Skarsgård, and the preference was given to Chris Hemsworth. He and Liam later assured that everything was great, and no one was offended. To prepare for the role of Thor, Chris Hemsworth actively gained mass for 6 months, visiting the gym and following a special diet. Before filming, he bulked up so much that he didn't fit into the original costume. It had to be altered to prevent it from bursting at the seams at the most inappropriate moment. Hemsworth mentioned that stunt coordinators searched for a fighting style that would suit his character for a long time. There were even ideas to borrow the legendary spinning kick and other real kung fu moves. However, when it became clear that the character resembled a swollen beer barrel, they settled on something resembling boxing. With comedic elements in the film and without spinning kicks from a barrel, there were still plenty of them. Perhaps many still remember those times. Audiences were very skeptical of films about the American Captain and the God of Thunder in 2011. Marvel was still quite different back then. However, despite all the industry's concerns, the first Thor was received fairly well. With a budget of $150 million, it grossed $449 million at the box office. It was a result worse than the first Iron Man, but it was still a box office success. The same couldn't be said about the first Avengers movie, which came out right after Thor, but that's another story. For Chris, dozens of producers immediately started jumping, offering him some significant role. But before he started fending off offers, he had a couple of movies that he signed up for before Thor. One of these films was shot in 2009 right after Star Trek, and if Cabin in the Woods hardly could have damaged his career, his role there was small but very effective. As for Red Dawn, it was just the perfect career killer. In 1984, Red Dawn became a big box office hit, grossing $38 million in the US alone, with a budget of. They tried to come up with some kind of sequel for several years, but ultimately, this idea fizzled out. Then, in 2008, MGM decided on a remake. Originally, the villains in the film were supposed to be terrorists, but when the script was written, someone thought that a terrorist takeover of America was too far-fetched. So it was deemed better to use the Chinese. The film went into production, and they wanted to spend $60 million on it, leaving more money for visual effects and equipment. They decided to cast actors through ads. This is when Chris appeared in Star Trek. Many liked him there, and he was willing to work for food. So he was quickly hired. The film encountered problems after shooting, and the variety of these problems doesn't allow us to accurately say what the main issue was. Perhaps everyone worked together. In early 2010, MGM decided to go bankrupt again, and someone from the producers noticed that Chinese invaders immediately closed the path to the Chinese market, which was experiencing rapid growth at the end of the 2000s. Then, there were test screenings that hinted at not the highest quality of the film. The studio didn't have money to reshoot the film, so the producers decided to just change all the flags and signs digitally and turn the Chinese into North Koreans. It lay in the vaults for over 2 years and was released in theaters at the end of 2012, when it couldn't harm Hemsworth anymore, as after Thor he had the Avengers and signed up for Snow White and the Huntsman. Red Dawn managed to collect only $51 million with a budget of $65 million, receiving crushing reviews from critics and audiences. The release of The Avengers in 2012 overshadowed everything that happened with the actors from this film. Somewhere around this time, War Studios, which was nearby, burst from envy, and even to this day, the studio backs off from the effect produced. After the release of Aquaman 2 and the final point in its burst universe, we will definitely stop at the demise of the DC universe at the box office. The Avengers grossed over $1.5 billion with a budget of $220 million. Chris Hemsworth received less than $1 million for this film. The Avengers premiered in April 2012, and already in May, Chris Hemsworth's new blockbuster, Snow White and the Huntsman, hit theaters. In the early stages of production, the studio wanted to see Viggo Mortensen in the lead role. Here, it's all the fault of The Lord of the Rings. The studio wanted to bring back Viggo's sword and let it strike, but Viggo didn't like the script, and after lengthy negotiations, he declined, settling only for the sword to be replaced with something more suitable for the actor's height and build. Chris said he was very pleased with the filming. He had similar weapons to Thor, and all he had to do was run around and hit someone. However, he had to suffer a bit in one scene. Actress Kristen Stewart miscalculated a blow and hit Hemsworth in the eye. After that, he had to spend a couple of hours at the makeup department, hiding the bruise. These hits left quite an impressive budget for the film. The director, Rupert Sanders, insisted that the film should look as realistic as possible. Because of this, the studio built a real castle for the film, which took over 6 months to build. The throne room of the studio cost $37. But there was one catch they couldn't account for: The Avengers, as no one expected such crazy box office returns from them. Before them, the highest-grossing film in the universe was Iron Man 2, which grossed just over $600 million. Around them, a bunch of different movies were released in theaters. For example, a week later, Dark Shadows, and then Battleship. Both films heroically died under the falling shadow of The Avengers, but it's believed that even those that came out a few weeks after them, like Snow White and the Huntsman and Men in Black 3, didn't get a fair share of the box office, as when they hit theaters, The Avengers was still making $20 to $40 million per weekend. This is usually how the risk of the studio with the second part of Snow White and the Huntsman in 2013 is explained. Finally, in his hands in 2013, Hemsworth got a bit of a different film for the role in Rush. He had to lose over 15 kilograms since all of this happened alongside the filming of the second Thor and the Avengers. The actor assures that he had to suffer a lot, and the film had to be shot in the tightest deadlines. Rush was supposed to be a very small film with scenes like some kind of historical chronicle. The script was written by Peter Morgan on his own initiative simply because he wanted to. That's why he thought that if someone noticed the script, it would be some small independent European film. But when he showed the finished script to director Ron Howard, who he worked with on the film Frost/Nixon, Howard was excited and said he would find the money and personally make the film. He found $40 million and also signed Chris Hemsworth, who had just appeared in The Avengers. Howard was so impressed with the actor's performance that he immediately invited him, and then it became clear that the actor wouldn't fit into the racing car. At the box office, Rush wasn't a big success, collecting only $90 million. But this is exactly the category of films whose shortcomings never harm anyone. The critics' and audience's ratings were too high, plus the film was inundated with various nominations. It was noted everywhere, except for Daniel Bruhl, and Chris didn't get any nominations, but he was sometimes told that he did a great job. The second Thor film was probably the first Marvel Cinematic Universe movie to be heavily criticized. This occurred for two main reasons, although there could have been more. The first reason involved Tom Hiddleston and Natalie Portman. Hiddleston was very well received by audiences in The Avengers, which led to him having more time in the original script of the second Thor film than planned. Much time was dedicated to the Dark Elves, but due to The Avengers releasing in mid-spring and the filming for the second Thor set to start in early September, changes had to be made in an emergency mode to include Loki in the film. The second reason was Natalie Portman's situation, where she found herself in a difficult spot when Patty Jenkins, responsible for the two Wonder Women, was removed from the film. Portman was unhappy with this decision and attempted to leave the project, but she was not allowed to do so, threatened with penalties. As a result, her character was removed from the plot as a villainess, and she was given more space in the script. Portman also insisted on platforms and scenes with Hemsworth so as not to appear too small next to him. She also demanded that her character kiss Thor. Later, her acting in this film was often criticized, but it was more due to the drama than her acting skills. This rush led to numerous changes in the script and constant reshoots of various scenes during filming. As a result, Idris Elba and Christopher Eccleston were under a lot of stress. Elba said he was supposed to shoot for just a couple of weeks, but then he was called back due to various problems. This led to a lot of stress for the actor. Chris Hemsworth was allowed to improvise at any moment, leading to the appearance of some jokes in the film. However, when the film was shot, it didn't appeal to the test audience and the director, so he was removed from the editing. The director claims that the version of the film that made it to theaters hardly resembles his work. Nevertheless, the second Thor film turned out to be quite successful at the box office in 2013, earning $644 million on a budget of $170 million. Chris had no films released that year. Or rather, only one film was supposed to be released, but something incredible happened. The quality was so poor that it was postponed. In the Heart of the Sea sank without a trace, and instead of Hemsworth, Henry Cavill could have starred. However, in the auditions, Chris emerged victorious. Cavill found himself struggling with agents. In the case of In the Heart of the Sea, there was also a delay from spring 2015 to December of the same year. Officially, the delay was due to the perceived award's potential. However, it later became known that test screenings were putting audiences to sleep, so significant portions of the film's first third were cut. Hemsworth's character wandered around the port, staring pensively into the distance and interacting with unnecessary characters. The Adventures of Chris the Whale Hunter before the Per-MIT. Ultimately, when it was released in December 2015, In the Heart of the Sea got overshadowed by Alvin and the Chipmunks, which dealt it a fatal blow. Despite there being the 7th Star Wars episode and the Hunger Games around, which also affected the movie's performance, it managed to make only $94 million on a $100 million budget. Hemsworth's career could have taken a hit in 2015, but as usual, the MCU came to the rescue with Avengers: Age of Ultron, which grossed $1.4 billion. So, all the hits Hemsworth's career took, it weathered, and in 2016, he planned for more box office flops. It was anticipated that Kristen Stewart and Chris Hemsworth would return for the sequel to Snow White and the Huntsman, directed by Rupert Sanders. However, due to the unsatisfactory box office performance of the first film and the scandal surrounding Kristen Stewart and Rupert Sanders, the studio decided to focus on a film about Hemsworth's character. There was a lot of noise about the Stewart-Sanders affair during the filming of the first film, and in those years, it was very powerful. Rupert was divorcing his wife in front of everyone and apologizing. Robert Pattinson, who was dating Kristen Stewart while filming Snow White, talked about how his soul unexpectedly died and how he cried into his pillow at night. Kristen Stewart also apologized, telling about solar flares and moving on to women. In general, the scandal, or a lot of it, and the studio got scared. Plus, they claimed that such a tricky move would help reduce the film's budget, although it was more likely due to the modest performance of the first film. The first film cost $170 million, while the second one was only $115 million, which was noticeable in the film itself. And if the first film in 2012 managed to reach the level of a pack of crackers and later make a profit from sales of media and TV, the sequel flopped without a trace, making only $165 million on a budget of $115 million. So, the planned trilogy dissolved into nothingness. In the same year, Hemsworth got involved in another comedy, again in a supporting role. Perhaps he had fun, but it was probably the most criticized. There were no such problems. Ghostbusters grossed only $229 million on a $144 million budget. Two serious flops could have sunk the actor, but in 2017, the third Thor happened. For this role, Hemsworth received $15 million, compared to $5 million for Avengers: Age of Ultron. And for the first Thor, he received only $400,000. The third Thor performed excellently at the box office, grossing $853 million on a budget of $180 million. It's hard to say how many actors and actresses would have sold their soul for such a lifeline in 2018. In the same year, Chris failed again with two films, Horse Soldiers and Bad Times at the El Royale. Both films had relatively modest budgets, with Horse Soldiers costing $35 million and grossing $68 million, including theater and advertising deductions. So, there will be a decent loss here, but chances are that later, with digital and television, the film will come out on top. As for the El Royale, it sank without a trace, making only $31 million on a $32 million budget. Interestingly, its audience ratings were significantly higher than those of the same Horse Soldiers, but such films are harder to market, making them less accessible to viewers. And yes, in the same year, Infinity War was released, which grossed over $2 billion at the box office. For this film, the actor also received $15 million. So, these minor stings from the El Royale and Horse Soldiers he probably didn't even notice. In 2019, the actor attempted to get his hands on another major franchise. A series about Match and Boaton sounds strange, but both series were successful at the box office, and in theory, it could have been something amusing. However, prolonged negotiations between the producers of the projects led to nothing. Match and Boaton's producer, Neil Morris, refused to share profits according to the principle proposed by the Men in Black franchise producers. So, the idea had to be abandoned, and the creators of Men in Black opted for a soft reboot of the series. The script by A.R. Hollow was taken into circulation, and Chris Hemsworth signed on to it. It was claimed that the script was, so to speak, day-old. It made a strong emphasis on migration issues and even had a serious dramatic component. However, in the same year, just before the start of filming, David Bober, the vice president of production at Sony Pictures, left the studio. He was in charge of the production of the new film and was excited about the existing script. When he left, the script management of the project shifted to producers Volty Parks and Laurie MacDonald. Parks and MacDonald were dissatisfied with the existing script and felt that the film was going in the wrong direction. Although filming had already started, the script did not save it, and it had to be rewritten. It got to the point where actors were handed pages with dialogue on the day of shooting. Director Greg Gray was frustrated and even tried to leave the film several times. Only threats from the studio stopped him, but on set, his confrontations with the producers often led to various scenes being filmed personally by producer Walter Parks. Hemsworth and Thompson hired their own dialogue writers because what came from the producers didn't suit them, and they demanded revisions. When filming was completed, the studio presented two versions of the film. One from producer Walter Parks and the other from director F. Agree. The studio chose the producer's version, and that's the one that made it to theaters. Rumor has it that the preference for Park's version was given only because it was almost ready, and the director's version would have cost several $1 million more, as the studio hoped to keep the budget within $100 million. The choice was made in favor of the producer's version. Without the director's version, it's difficult to say whether producers Parks and McDonald saved the film or buried it even deeper. The resulting film grossed $253 million on a budget of $110 million. No one dared to continue such a soft reboot. So, there's a lot of talk now about rebooting the franchise without any likeness. As for his next failure, Chris covered it up with the new Avengers, who came out alongside Men in Black and grossed $2.8 billion. Only the first Avatar collected more than them in its entire history. In 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, streaming platforms became a lifeline for many actors, including Hemsworth, who had experienced failures in 5 consecutive films unrelated to the Marvel Universe. He decided to try his hand on the Netflix platform, where film failures are not as noticeable, and if they exist, only the platform's accounting department knows about them. The plot of his film Operation Rescue was simple, but the film became one of the most popular contents on Netflix. Hemsworth continued to work with this platform, making only an exception for the 4th Thor. Another film of his for Netflix, Spiderhead, did not make it to the top lists, but its success is difficult to assess without data. However, the sequel to Operation Rescue again showed excellent results, although it was slightly inferior to the first part. Thus, it can be considered that Hemsworth is doing well on Netflix. Next year, the actor is expected to return to theaters with a prequel to Mad Max, Fury Road, where he will play one of the warlords. The movie has already been filmed, and post-production is currently underway. If it is not postponed, you can expect to see it in the post-apocalyptic world in May 2024. Things are not going smoothly for Marvel Studios. Film revenues have plummeted significantly, and some have even failed. Hemsworth has plans for a 5th Thor, but it is currently unclear when it will be released. Perhaps his lifeline will disappear in the near future. Overall, this video can be seen as preparation for a video about the ups and downs of Marvel Studios. If the upcoming 2nd Captain Marvel and the 4th Captain America perform poorly, such a video will no longer seem far-fetched.